The other one, hey, most of the financial press is calling them success stories. They're all emphasizing green shoots. They take hook, line, sinker, rod, reel, boat that you rode out in, these claims that there really actually was no problem, that the banks are all the big banks are healthy. Did you know that? Why is there a financial crisis if they're all healthy? Why did Geithner tell us it was going to cost $2 trillion to fix it? It doesn't square, right? But people don't remember that. Anyway, what to do to fix it? We're trying, as I say, to give alternative views. You give people their best service when you tell them the truth, not when you tell them what they want to hear. You need to fix executive compensation so that it no longer creates perverse incentives. That's fairly straightforward, right? Because we do everything wrong in executive compensation now compared to what all the books say you should do. Again, if you put a negative sign in front of that, that's what we do. We base it on short-term accounting gains instead of real long-term performance. So change that. It's the most important single thing. Do a real PCORA investigation. Give the FBI at least 500, actually needs far more than that, needs 2,000 new FBI agents to do the case. The Justice Department needs more prosecutors as well. Hey, we got lots of lawyers in America. That's not a problem, as long as you give them the budget to do it. Prioritize, triage, go after the big players first before the statute of limitations runs. Deal with the regulatory black holes. Californians should know those. This is what produced the California energy crisis, folks.
Enron generated that one.
Enron generated that one and exploited that as part of the cartel. That was front to back, no ifs, ands, or buts, fraud and cartel. So get rid of those black holes on financial derivatives. In general, there's no reason for over-the-counter derivatives, and they're an invitation to disaster as opposed to exchange-traded derivatives and such. So those would be the 5 or 6 things that you could do promptly that would not only deal with this crisis, but dramatically reduce the risk of future crises. And of course, I'm sorry, I have to mention something else. Given our discussion, you got to appoint the right kind of folks as regulators, not the Geithners and Summers of the world, who, again, they never believed in regulation. They were rampant deregulators, and proud of it.
Well, I wanted to talk about, as bad as it is, and you've given us a plan here. I don't know how to implement it and who's going to champion it and who's even going to talk about it. But that aside, I understand that there are some more shoes to drop in terms of the global economy that may mirror what we've just gone through, and that the most vulnerable part of the global economy is Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, and they borrowed heavily in euros, and they're in the non-euro zone. They have absolutely no ability to pay back these loans. The stress on the West European banks will be such that it will drag us back into it.
Yes, we are overall, and by the we, I mean most of the Western world, following pretty much the Japanese plan for dealing with severe economic banking crises, which is to cover it up. The Nikkei...
That was the zombie bank decade, right?
Well, it's now 2 decades, right? The Nikkei remains at 25% of its peak value 19 years later. Let me say that another way. Imagine if the Dow Jones lost 75% of its value and stayed that way for 2 decades. What would America be like? Japan's in its 4th rolling recession, and it's a really severe recession, much more severe than ours currently. Spain has 17% unemployment. Iceland's collapsed. Ireland's largely collapsed. Latvia needs IMF bailout. Iceland needed an IMF bailout. You're right about Hungary and other nations are in a state of collapse, but no one wants to admit it because the Germans and others are playing the same games with their banks. recognize losses, that would be a terrible thing. Do you know that Congress extorted the accounting profession to loosen the accounting rules so that banks could essentially give any value they wanted to their assets, and that they have done so? And surprise, those values are really, really high compared to the real value.
Well, at the moment, there's a political band-aid being offered. It's tied into the appropriations for the two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan. A big chunk of change for the IMF that's supposed to put a band-aid over these vulnerable countries in the former Warsaw Pact and the Baltic states. That's being held up by the Republicans. Even Bill Gates is now pleading with the Republicans not to be so stupid. What do you think will happen if that Band-Aid's not thrown their way? I mean, in other words, can an IMF Band-Aid, will that be sufficient to stop this thing from unraveling, and then we go through another? In other words, is this Europe subprime?
Yes, it will. I mean, Hungary will collapse, right? And the local currency has already collapsed, but it will further collapse. It'll produce a classic exchange rate crisis, just like it happened in Iceland. A number of these shoes are going to drop. Here in the United States, the pick-a-pay option arms, where you got to pick what rate you would pay, and virtually everyone picked a rate that, in our jargon, is deeply negative amortization. That means you're not even paying enough to pay the interest, which means the unpaid interest gets added to your principal. Can you imagine that? Those are going to cease that feature in the next 2 calendar years. And those are huge numbers. And they're really big here in California. Very popular product. Those people are going to suddenly face dramatically increased payments on houses that have lost very substantial value, where they're going to owe probably somewhere in the range often of 130% of the market value of their house. So yes, there are many bad shoes to drop. This strategy will not work. It will make things far worse. The worst possible incentive is to leave the CEOs in charge of banks that they know are insolvent, where they produce the insolvency. Guess what strategy we followed? Exactly that strategy. And we know, both from economics and criminology and just plain human experience, that's the worst thing you can do. So naturally, it's the one we've done.
Well, but an economic collapse brings about the worst kind of politics. And we don't have an educated polity to begin with. Nobody's much is talking about what we're talking about here. So the picture you're painting means that we're going to have a crisis and a collapse on our hands, and we'll have, Newt Gingrich and Sarah Palin running the country.
Well, the savings and loan debacle led to a lot of very effective reforms. The Great Depression led to a number of very effective reforms, in part because, again,
But we're not even talking reform. We're not talking prosecution. We're not talking reform.
I understand, but I'm not willing to give up. We are working with members of Congress, and we're trying to get change. The first thing you need to do obviously, whatever's gushing, you stop, you clamp a Band-Aid on. But after that, your first priority should be finding the facts. That's what we did in the savings and loan debacle. We found out why the failures occurred, and we addressed it. That's what we did in the Great Depression with things like Glass-Steagall from Pecora, and we addressed it. Well, are we going to do that now? Are we going to find the facts? This stuff about, we need to be forward-looking, we don't want to dwell in the past. What would happen if we treated air crashes that way, folks? Oh, no, we're not really going to investigate why that plane came down. And we want you to know that planes are safe. And we've done a stress test. Right. That would be a disastrous strategy, right? Our strategy has produced, of looking intensively at every major crash, has led to aviation being extraordinarily safe despite the recent